Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, as countries around the world slowly begin unlocking their lockdowns, how will airlines, assuming they can survive that long, return to the skies? And how might air travel have to change as part of that process? It's another Airline Business Pop-Up Podcast. My name's Graham Dunn, and joining me, as ever, is my airline business colleague, Lewis Harper.
Hi, Graham. How are you?
Not too bad, getting ever deeper into this lockdown mode, and it's almost become quite habit-forming now.
It has, yes. So we're obviously firmly established now working remotely, and we're doing this podcast via the one of the many kind of online meeting pieces of software that everyone's using at the moment. But we've got into a bit of a rhythm now. So covering all of this obviously day to day on flightglobal.com, and we started to see a kind of bit of a shift maybe in the news agenda. Would you kind of say that?
Yeah, I think so. I think for the first 2 or 3 weeks of everything, it was really about the kind of winding down. There were a lot of the coverage was airlines grounding aircraft. We wrote enormous number of stories of different airline X, airline Y, steadily grounding aircraft, grounding operations. There were kind of initial periods as to how long they would stop for, and gradually, obviously, the projections got worse and worse. And certainly over the last week or two in particular, I think things have very much now moved to the crunch period for airlines in terms of they need measures right now to survive this crisis.
Yeah, it's very much been obviously in the early days of this, the IATA was obviously really strong on its messaging that most airlines, aside from some of the huge players, probably only had 2 or 3 months worth of liquidity to see them through, and we're obviously heading towards that point at the moment. So whereas IATA's messaging in those early days was very strongly on that, it's kind of feels like we maybe reached the point now where a lot of governments have stepped in, whether directly to help airlines or indirectly through wider measures that are designed to keep their economy ticking over as much as possible. But we've really reached the point now where I think, we're starting perhaps to see the critical point being reached by some carriers. And as an example in the last few days, of course, is Virgin Australia.
Yes, absolutely. Virgin Australia, they'd asked for specific amounts of funding and made a direct plea for bailout money. The government in Australia did do things. Australia, as a market, has it's taken its own lockdown steps, but there are some signs of recovery in that market, I guess. But it just wasn't enough for Virgin Australia. Virgin Australia is a really interesting airline. Anyway, for lots of reasons, it's financially, it's had a bad run. It's made a loss for the last 7 years, not massive losses, but it's struggled to turn a profit in what has largely been a profitable period for airlines. It's a hugely attractive player for airlines because it has strategic partnerships with its investors, include Singapore Airlines, Etihad, H&A, Air New Zealand were involved before, and of course, with Australia being the huge market there and essentially a duopoly with Qantas and Virgin Australia, from a consumer side and from a commercial side, having that second player is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and because of that, I think there does seem to be some hope. It's a voluntary administration, so there appears to be some hope that something could still emerge from the administration process, and there's certainly been interest. Of course, it's important to point out that we heard similar things maybe when Jet Airways went under last year, but that hasn't really, obviously hasn't got anywhere in terms of getting back into the air again. But yeah, I think one thing that comes through in this example when we talk about the situations airlines find themselves in is in one of I think the first Flight Global webinar we had since this crisis began, we had Chris Tarry, one of the analysts and contributor to Airline Business, talk about the moral hazard that governments face in deciding whether to help airlines during this crisis. And there's kind of a danger, I guess, that governments would be very aware that they don't want to be propping up businesses that were failing already and essentially just prolonging the death of that business, I guess, to put it in quite blunt terms. So I think with the case of Virgin Australia, as you talked about, it's a huge, it's a lucrative market, but the key point is that Virgin Australia have been struggling for years, haven't been profitable for years. And though those years included what we would look at as the peak of what certainly even more so now, the 2017 time, sort of the peak of profitability for carriers. So even during that period, it was struggling. So it put forward, a number of rescue options to the government, which the government did not agree to. So I think, as I go back to Chris's point, that the governments aren't just going to throw money at airlines or any type of business, willy-nilly during this time. They've got to feel that there's some return from it when restrictions are lifted. So, but as you say, the Virgin Australia is interesting because of that. A lot of people saw it as a worthwhile strategic and financial investment.
And it's interesting. One of the other points that Chris had made, which was around the complications of governments rescuing or investing to rescue airlines, which aren't totally owned by the state itself. So, I was reading this morning about Nordica, the Estonian operation, and that's I think seeking around 20 million euros in state support. There's a whole debate there because LOT, the Polish airline, owns half that airline, and the question would be, well, should they be funded? Now, of course, LOT is in no better position to fresh money in because LOT has the same problem as every other airline that's not flying. So, it's not straightforward how governments necessarily can step in to help their airlines. And
the ultimate example of that might be at the moment Virgin Atlantic. So a Virgin carrier, this time where the Virgin Group is 51% owner of the carrier. But there's obviously a perception that Richard Branson is not based in the UK, and obviously having him as the figurehead of the business has been a big boost for Virgin Atlantic in the past. But at the moment, it's not looking quite that way. But at the same time, that obviously there's a lot of focus on Branson, but at the same time, obviously there are thousands of jobs at stake in the UK, and Virgin Atlantic was allowed to fall over. So as ever, I think within all of this moral quandary faced by governments, the airline industry is very vulnerable to quite negative coverage that seems to be out of proportion, I guess, with what some other businesses would get. That a lot of big businesses will have very complicated ownership structures, but because of the very public-facing nature of airlines and because of figures like Branson, it gets a lot of attention, and that won't always be helpful for airlines. As I say, there's two ways of looking. There's multiple ways of looking at everything, but certainly with Virgin Atlantic, as I was saying, it's big competition to what otherwise would be close to a monopoly for BA at Heathrow, for example. And it does support thousands of jobs, and obviously directly and indirectly through the economy. So these within these moral quandaries, that all these other factors are playing in, like how it's being covered by the press and everything. So yeah, it's very complicated situation that, and I don't think every airline's going to obviously survive this.
No, and I think it's interesting that even in the US, which very swiftly acted to make funds available, and you've seen in the past week US carriers agreeing now to draw down funds under the CARES package, 50 billion euros, $50 million made available for US carriers in one form or another. But even that came with caveats, came with catches, around a requirement to operate minimum services on various destinations to keep a skeleton service. US carriers, I saw some data from a week or so ago that they've got load factors around 9% on domestic flights. That is, they clearly aren't a sort of profitable element. And you've seen, many US carriers in taking in accepting the funding support have been trying to get exemptions, not particularly successfully from what I can see in terms of that route network. And then there's further questions around loans which are available in terms of it providing essentially the US government becoming a shareholder within that and what kind of role it would play there.
Yeah, and then beyond that, I guess we talk about obviously governments helping carriers. If you're already a state-owned carrier and you were already struggling going into this, and I'm thinking of South African as an example of a carrier that, by a lot of accounts, looks like it's nearing the end of the line, with the caveat that we know, Alitalia, for example, we know that particularly government-owned carriers, it's difficult to know, measure where the end of the line is at times because they can always be kept going in some form. And at the moment, when there's nothing flying really anyway, it's difficult to judge what would be happening if we weren't facing this global crisis. So, but certainly SAA is a carrier that is one to keep an eye on, I guess, in terms of where there'd be doubts about them getting through this crisis.
As you say, companies that were already struggling beforehand, the pressure has come more quickly than, or the crunch point has come more quickly than it has for others. But I think we've seen, even for the sort of profitable and successful carriers, it hasn't been plain sailing. Someone like EasyJet in the UK, which good financial track record, has grown well. And it's, I think its chief executive was talking about having sort of 9 months worth of cash, being able to sustain itself during a grounding. Obviously, it's had a very vocal and determined shareholder in Stelios, making quite a lot of noise in terms of the fears of expanding too far, and particularly an Airbus order that they have. Yeah,
so the Stelios situation has provided a bit of a sideshow, I guess, with all this going on. Seeing his name all over the media, with, as you say, over quite a strong argument over the status of that Airbus order, and I think for all airlines, the unknowns are obviously the problem at the moment. And I think it's key to all of this. And when we talk about government help and all of those factors, we just don't know. And if IATA's prediction is correct, and there's a slow recovery beginning in the third quarter, then these kind of arguments around EasyJet and things, I guess, may fade away to a point. There obviously no one's talking about airlines taking any aircraft this year or having a particularly big appetite for them for some time. But clearly there are so many different paths that could play out, and I have my doubts about anyone who's confident on what they may be. But certainly talking about the government support, obviously if we begin to see airlines coming back into some form of service at the start of the third quarter, then I guess we start to see a slightly more optimistic picture, and that immediate need for funding may not be as strong, but certainly under some other scenarios, and we all know that we've heard enough people say that the only way we get truly out of this crisis would be a vaccine being widely available, for example, or maybe a treatment that makes the getting the virus less detrimental to health. So we all know that kind of maybe the ultimate goal, and that in between that we could see another peak in cases, for example, where the need for funding is even greater. So it's there's a lot to play out, and
I think one of the things you are certainly seeing, though, from airlines is an acceptance that it is going to be a smaller world when they resume services, I guess, aren't you? It's interesting to see, EasyJet deferred a relatively small number of aircraft. Lufthansa has taken steps around its fleet, perhaps being one of the first to sort of permanently take aircraft out. And I think it's sort of quite interesting in terms of, I think, again, over the last couple of weeks, there's maybe been a kind of recognition, and we've certainly seen it among aircraft lessors cancelling various commitments for aircraft as well, particularly around the MAX, where there is a recognition this is going to take a long time to get out and they're not going to need that level of aircraft in the fleet.
Yeah, and I think again we've heard I think a lot of people say as well that the airlines that responded quickly or saw this coming the earliest are giving themselves a much better chance of getting through this. You're right, because as you say, Lufthansa was very quick to, the Carsten Spohr was very quick to acknowledge this was going to be a smaller industry when we came out of this. Amazingly quick, really. You think it was literally, a week or two after lockdowns began. This, reflecting the seriousness of what we all know we're facing. So those airlines that responded quickly, again, some airlines are more levers to pull than others. Obviously, with a huge fleet, over 700 aircraft, like Lufthansa Group has. There's I guess in several aircraft types, there's a bit more room to make those decisions in a logical way. So taking out of service, A380s, for example, that where there are already question marks around their suitability and the economics of them on the routes they're flying. But you're right. We are. That is a big part of what's playing out as well at the moment. And again, obviously, the duration of this crisis will have a lot to say on that. But certainly, when we talk about aircraft orders and things, I think it's important to note that obviously the desire for airlines to have the most economical aircraft isn't going to go away. Not least because that ultimately saves them money, but also because we've probably forgotten a bit about the environmental agenda and how much that was really battering airlines going into this crisis, and that's not going to go away. So while they'll be searching for savings on in the immediate future on bringing those aircraft in, what a trend that's obviously going to play out and is playing out already is the older aircraft being retired from fleets much sooner than expected. We've seen that everywhere. I mean, obviously, I spoke to Air Baltic a few weeks ago, a similar thing happening there. Q400s, 737s out of the fleet much earlier than expected, so they can concentrate on the A220, which is much more economical.
Of course, there are another of those bizarre paradoxes as it all is. Arguably, there will never be a better time to start an airline in terms of picking up some cheap aircraft at a time where oil will almost pay you to take it with the oil where it is now.
Yeah, that I guess that is another thing playing into this. Of course, there is that we expect oil to be depressed for some time. So at the same time, as you say, while that's playing out, I guess if you are starting up an airline, there's certainly going to be a lot of very cheap older aircraft types on the market that would give you that opportunity. But I would say I think it's important that carriers don't lose sight of that environmental agenda, because I think that one thing that's playing out during this crisis is it is bringing a lot of people's minds to climate change as another kind of existential threat that humans are facing. And I think once things begin to return to some normality, that when we talk about lessons learned from this crisis, I think that will be high up the agenda. Of course, as ever, there'll be a balancing act between, as you say, the fact that these older aircraft will be burning more fuel, but fuel is likely to be much cheaper. So there may be options for startups, as you say, from some smaller carriers that survive this to get hold of an expanded fleet to maybe fill the hole left by a rival that's collapsed, for example. But that relies on fuel staying low and there being the demand there, obviously. But certainly those dynamics will play out. But I don't, there will be obviously a short, medium-term reduction in the need for newer aircraft, but that need will still be there, I think, when a semblance of normality returns.
And I think just coming back to that environmental point, one of the other interesting parts about it is, of course, that airlines that are having to look to government for support, and I think we will see, or certainly be discussed. It's probably going to be a political argument within governments, whether the governments look to use that lever that they have over airlines to try and step up environmental commitments or pledges around tackling the environment in an even stronger way. I think the debates will, I'm sure debates we have, or the people have all the time about the pros of aviation against the environmental concerns, the economic pros, and societal pros against the environmental challenges. And I think those will be absolutely accelerated discussions with governments during this period.
I reckon so, and particularly when you think that part of the way governments are helping airlines in some cases will be that they'll be either deferring or reducing taxes that would have been at least partly imposed with airlines' environmental impact in mind. So that there'll be other ways that, like you say, that governments will be asking airlines about that as part of this. I guess it has to be part of the consideration that issue isn't going away. So, and at the same time, you could imagine, airlines, the kind of go-to answer to what are airlines doing about the environment before, the pressure really ramped up in the last few months was always, well, we're buying all these new aircraft that give us 15, 20% efficiency savings. And again, that there's a point where airlines will need to stick to their promises on that if they, to get through the short term, obviously not. But I think the longer term, that's going to be absolutely crucial still. And you think about governments, where they're based in countries where their, aircraft manufacturing is a big employer and a big, contributor to the economy. Again, when they're talking to airlines about, well, we'll help you, but what are your plans for your big Airbus order or whatever? Then I'm sure that kind of thing comes into play. But yeah, it's all unknowns. But certainly there are some things I think that will hold pretty steady through this.
So as you say, they're all unknowns, and probably the biggest unknown at the moment is when normal airline services might resume and how they might have to change. And we'll talk about that in part 2.
Download for free our digital airline business special, sponsored by CFM International, looking at how airlines are facing up to the coronavirus challenge. Go to flightglobal.com/airline business.
Well, one of the big questions is not only when air travel might return to normal, it's how it's going to be impacted over the when services can and do return. And we've seen quite a lot of talk in the media around the potential around how social distancing will become part of that process. Yeah,
there's two things, I guess. Generally, when you're looking at the economy, there's obviously the narrative that things can start opening up again. But one key consideration is whether people themselves will actually want to then use services as they were before. So that's an important consideration around this, really, because certainly in some countries there's a perception that maybe people were essentially locking down before lockdowns were even imposed because they were concerned for their health, their family's health, and everyone. So certainly that's an important thing when we're talking about capacity returning and demand returning. Again, there are just so many unknowns. But certainly, obviously, something that's getting a lot of coverage, as you say, is the social distancing. Where in the UK, for example, the idea is when you're out in public, that with people not from your household, you should be maintaining 2 meters distance at all time, whenever possible. Obviously, in some cases it's not, but certainly the obvious question that a lot of people are asking is, well, if I'm going to be sitting on a plane for several hours, next to someone I don't know, how does that fit into that narrative? And certainly, I think it's impossible to answer, really, because we don't know what government requirements are going to be when there's actually the chance to fly again. But I think the key point is those social distancing. If it is keep 2 meters, for as long as it is keep 2 meters away from people as long as possible, then obviously air travel is going to be seriously impacted. And I don't think airlines are going to have an answer for that necessarily, and I don't think they can, because that social distancing is a problem throughout the economy. It's not, airlines aren't going to solve it, and even if they could solve it themselves, I think as long as there is that social distancing requirement, people aren't going to be wanting to to travel as much, I think, is ultimately the way I would see it anyway, because, if they travel, they can't then enjoy restaurants, enjoy, any kind of social occasion the way they would normally. So that there's kind of, I don't think airlines are going to solve this on their own. And I think ultimately it's not a problem that they will be able to solve is the way I would see it.
So yes, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's been a lot of attention, for example, on, would airlines be able to leave the middle seat free, for example, as a way of introducing social distancing on board, which I don't really applies anyway. But, fundamentally, if people aren't comfortable enough to be sat next to somebody on board a plane, they're not going to be comfortable enough sat next to someone by the side of a pool or on holiday or in a conference, whatever it is. So it's probably a slightly moot point anyway, although, we heard IATA's Director General Alexander de Junior very clearly outlining that, of that, which, on a short haul flight would involve roughly cutting capacity by a third. That is just not a economically viable way of operating. And if you think low cost carriers are working on a break-even load factor of, not break-even load factor, but load factors of high, in high 80s, possibly even in the 90s. If your baseline is the equivalent of, say, 70% of that on board, your prices are going to have to go up.
Yeah, and that, as I said, as a low-cost carrier, is a tough one to kind of work out. As you say, the ultimate problem is keeping the middle seat free doesn't mean you're 2 meters away from everyone as well. I think it's important to say, obviously, the way airlines have developed in recent years has all been around the density of seating. So there is a danger kind of airlines to solve a problem that doesn't exist in that sense, that not having someone in the middle seat still means you're I imagine in most cases much closer than 2 meters to people around you, to crew, and that kind of thing. So, and we're at an early stage obviously of talking about the comeback, but I think it is important to acknowledge those points, but also I guess on the other side, when we're not talking about these being formal requirements as such, there may be, it may help encourage passengers more at the point where that's possible, that there is a level of distancing on the flight, I guess. But I think that's kind of short term. I think in the longer term, and EasyJet kind of talks about this, that because they won't be selling, expect to sell many tickets in the early days when a comeback starts, that the distancing can happen to a point anyway. But in the longer term, that just not viable for the business model. And as we say, I think it's not a problem that can uniquely be solved by the airlines anyway.
And I think you're right. It's I think quite a lot of what we're going to be hearing over the next few weeks is going to be probably based around short-term measures and short-term arrangements that would in much the same way as we've seen separation, orderly queuing at supermarkets. I think there will be associated with any return to flights. There would be return to flying. There would be, some measures put in place, temporary period, until there's some sort of vaccine or other health solution to this. I guess there's also a perception that people have to feel comfortable to travel again. And airlines will have to consider, not just airlines, the whole travel industry will have to consider all kinds of ways to sort of support that. And that to some extent there may be measures which don't necessarily have that much pragmatism to them. They don't do any harm. I suppose it's like there's a big debate around the extent to which face masks help or don't help. In the general, what's evident is that clearly not going to do any harm. The level of benefit, and but maybe there is a sort of psychological value to it.
Yeah, I think confidence is going to be everything really once people are able to travel again. The thing we really can't predict how much for everyone saying this is going to change everything forever, there are obviously people saying that people just go back to normal, but in any scenario, the time it takes to reach whatever normal becomes is going to be crucial to so many businesses, particularly airlines, where it does feel they're very much on the front line of this in terms of the impact that a global outbreak has on a sector which is all about traveling globally and internationally in a lot of cases. So you're right. I think that the confidence thing is regardless of whatever official guidelines are in place of what needs to be done or requirements or regulations. I think confidence is going to be everything. And along those lines, we've seen obviously even in the last few days, Emirates has been putting out images of people being tested for COVID-19 before boarding a flight. Now, there are maybe specific reasons on certain routes where you need to have an immunity certificate when you arrive in a country, but so there are some practical reasons for doing that. But obviously the practicalities of rolling that out generally are questionable. But also the fact is that, again, thinking about the consumer confidence when you fly, you really want to be sure when you're leaving your house on the way to the airport that you're not heading to an airport that's full of people that are potentially passing on the disease, and so it's kind of too late in the process, I think, to be that meaningful in terms of the confidence of consumers to be testing at the airport. I think, again, as much as airlines and airports can try to come up with solutions, I think ultimately we are reliant on more across the wider society that things move on in a positive way. But as you say, the confidence side of things is maybe a different equation where you're not doing things necessarily because they are scientifically crucial in fighting the disease. It's more about giving people that reassurance that the airlines and airports are thinking about the customer. But easier said than done, because as we've pointed out, IATA said in their briefing yesterday that if you've got to wipe out a third of all seats from a short haul flight, you're essentially flying at a loss unless you put ticket prices up 50%. And then that creates there are many ways in which you could see the airline industry going back a couple of decades through as a result of this crisis, and one of them might be that flying is really expensive again, and the preserve of people that are much wealthier in society, more state-owned carriers as well. So we hopefully don't reach that point, but certainly there is a danger if that there are requirements, or if the demand just doesn't come back because people are too worried about being sat next to someone for 2 hours or up to 15, 16 hours. So yeah, but everything's unknown at the moment. But the airline industry isn't going to solve many of these challenges on its own, I think. And I think the other thing around confidence, or when we think about how markets come back or the fly comes back, I think as well, we were talked previously, and IATA talked about it again, around how the domestic markets are likely to be the ones that come back first for the sort of kind of obvious reasons. With international travel, as we've seen in China, raises then the problem of or the risk of importing, or the fear of importing the disease. I think probably, I suspect what we will start to see is the emergence of blocks. You saw that within Australia and New Zealand. There's lots of talk about creating where you sort of, because for those, if you're the US, you have a big enough market. Theoretically, it wouldn't be the same, but they could create a relatively sustainable. It's 14% of all traffic last year was in the US domestic market, so that's pretty sustainable. But for other countries, other economies, I think there will be, the step beyond domestic markets will start to be a step to perhaps join link economies. We've seen that with countries, neighbouring countries. I think we'll see that in Scandinavia, for example. And, air travel can play a small part within that. I think so, and that will be. And I know IATA, of course, they're talking in regional terms with stakeholders about this kind of how this will roll out. As you say, there may be some reticence to the idea that air travel would be split up in that way. I can understand some reticence, but it may be the only way we can slowly get back to some level of normality. As you say, you look at New Zealand, where Cases are incredibly low because they locked down so quickly. In Australia, where we're seeing new cases down to extremely low levels, where it's realistic. I guess you could start up flights between the two. No, it's an important caveat is, of course, no one's saying. Very few people I've heard have suggested that this disease can be eradicated as such. It's going to be around in one form or the other until we, forever in the sense, but obviously we're hoping it'll be controlled in some way fairly soon. But you're right, the domestic markets are interesting. And you look at a carrier like Southwest, for example, which is largely, it does have international markets, but it's a huge player in the US domestic market. And you could probably include Canada in this. You can imagine there being, an agreement at some point that flights in the North American countries could resume, and a lot, as you say, that market is so huge that it could sustain quite a decent amount of global traffic on its own. But obviously, the important caveat with this is that airlines, even in the US, make a lot of money from international long-haul services. I think the domestic markets are good for airports, for example, and in terms of passenger numbers. So domestic markets coming back, I think IATA reckons around nearly 60% of passengers are on domestic services across the world. But in terms of ASK, so in terms of RPKs, so the actual money airlines are earning, the majority is on international services. So there's actually a bit of a mismatch there, where actually airports will benefit with domestic services coming back, because there are so many airports. We often, it's easy just to think about the huge international hubs, but there's so many airports that are kind of serving regions within a country or within a block of countries where, like the EU, for example, where you don't hear about them every day, but they rely on those domestic services. And so domestic services coming back will be a boon to airports, particularly, and some domestic carriers. But the important point is that a lot of countries aren't big enough to have domestic markets, or simply don't have particularly large domestic markets, because the sector isn't as mature as it is in other places. So from an airline perspective, certainly any relief is good. But transatlantic, for example, is such a huge part of any airline operating in that sector, of their revenue and their profitability, that domestic markets can only take you so far when you've got them. And obviously, those domestic markets are fed to an extent by people travelling internationally into the country. So they're linked to a point, but certainly, as I are to say, we expect to see domestic come back, then regional, and it's going to be the intercontinental kind of long haul that is likely to be further off.
So plenty to talk about. Before we sign off, I thought we should probably mention, in a sort of rare plug for what we've been doing, we've put together a pretty unusual edition of Airline Business, because the normal rules of engagement went out of the window, and everything that's about coronavirus and the impact on the industry. And we've spoken to existing executives, people who've been there, who have been through previous crises.
As much as this is obviously a terrible time for the industry and for the airline industry and the publishing industry, let's be honest, it's no one's escaping this at the moment. But we were able to put together an issue that is incredibly focused on the coronavirus challenges, as you say, and in that we it's not a normal issue of Airline Business as such, so it's digital only. But you can, if you go to flightglobal.com, the Airline Business section, you'll be able to find the issue there. We were able to speak to 4 chief executives. Obviously, we normally just have a big interview of one. But we're able to speak to Ed Sims from WestJet, with Tony Douglas from Etihad, obviously Martin Gauss from Air Baltic, and Peter Foster from Air Astana. So a decent geographic spread there of CEOs that we've spoken to since the crisis has started. So some great insight there. We've also got some summaries of the key points from our Flight Global webinars, where people including Christoph Muller, Tony Tyler, and as we mentioned earlier, Chris Tarry was involved with one of them, highly respected analyst who writes for Airline Business. So, and that these are people that have seen crises before. I think they all acknowledge this is on a scale they haven't seen before, but certainly they talk about the lessons learned and how they see this playing out. So, overall, there's a very focused issue. If you're looking for that kind of fairly in-depth overview of where the sector is and where it might be going, I'd say it's a great thing to look at, because there's a lot of noise at the moment, not just on the airline sector generally, but we've tried to make this issue really focused on covering the key points that everyone needs to know at the moment. So please take a look.
Excellent. And you can get to that at flightglobal.com/airline business.
Flight Global has launched a series of webinars featuring leading industry executives and analysts from around the world to dissect how different parts of the aviation sector are navigating the coronavirus crisis. Listen to these on demand at flightglobal.com/webinar. So that's all for this time. You can find links to the stories we have referenced, including the Digital Airline Business Special on the coronavirus crisis, in the podcast notes. And you can keep up to date with all the latest on how airlines are responding to the global grounding at the new look flightglobal.com. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review and don't forget to subscribe. And we'll see you again next time.